welcome to the Ireland on the Fly podcast about the people and places of fly fishing in Ireland. And for this week's episode, I catch up with one of Ireland's adopted sons, Peter Mantle of Delphi Lodge fame. After success with setting up and running fishing lodges in Connemara and then the Bahamas, Peter has returned home to England to dry fly fishing on the River Test, where he runs a much smaller enterprise called Chapel House. I speak to Peter about the trials and tribulations of running a fishing lodge, the numerous obstacles he's had to overcome, and most importantly, how he has succeeded despite it all. From fish disease and fish farms to recessions, hurricanes and even a global pandemic, nothing has deterred him, and he has done it all with a wry sense of humour along the way. This then is Peter Mantle on his final fishing project.
Well, I should stress this is pretty small scale. We're sort of semi-retired, having largely pulled out of the Bahamas, and we just thought we'd go mad without some ongoing source of company as much as anything else. It is a commercial continuation of running a fishing lodge, but only on a very small scale for 2 bedrooms, with fishing on the local River Test.
So was it very much a case of, I know when we last spoke, and you had the Bahamas, but then even though I know you were kind of talking about maybe the UK was an option sometime down the road, is that even though you're semi-retired, you still can't help yourself in many ways?
Well, yeah, no, I really mean it. I think I would go bonkers if we didn't have some continuing connection with the fishing world. And living in the middle of Hampshire, in the sort of home of dry fly fishing, it just seemed an obvious thing to do, but on a much more manageable scale, where we can basically do it ourselves, have guests in our own home. And I'm lucky enough to own with some friends a beat on the Test, and I have other friends who own other beats. So we can access these rather pretty gentle, low-key forms of fishing, which are a bit different to anything we've done before.
Was it always back in your mind, Peter, that you did want to go retire kind of around on the Test?
I wouldn't say always. It was perhaps a small fantasy that we might end up doing that. When I first left Ireland in 2012, obviously the centre of gravity moved to the Bahamas, but that was always seen as being a 9 or 10 year plan. And as we neared the end of that 10 years, which we'd started in 2009, we started looking around for other options. And we had thought of buying this big old mill that stands on the River Test instead of where we live at the moment. But we realized that was just too big a scale. It would have been another Delphi type operation with a need for staff and, all that. So we decided, no, we just... we do it ourselves on a very small scale, largely aimed at people we already knew through either Delphi Island or Delphi Bahamas. And we took our first guests in last year.
Actually, tell me this. Was that a conscious thing then, you didn't want to brand it Delphi?
That's a good question. Yeah, no, I mean, the house is called Chapel House. It would seem a little bit forced to alter that. Had we bought this other place, the big mill, we might have, I don't know, called it Delphi Chalk Stream or something like that. But no, I think the Delphi connection remains in the form of the people, but not in the branding, as it were.
So are you still involved with Delphi Bahamas?
Yeah, I'm still a shareholder in it, but I no longer, thankfully, have any involvement with the day-to-day running of it. And the people who largely assumed that mantle have been dealt a pretty rough hand of cards. First of all, the hurricane last year, which wiped out the island, although not the lodge. And just as they were recovering and reopening from that, the Bahamas government introduced a pretty draconian lockdown because of COVID. So they're closed up over there until November. And so you could say we were very lucky to get the majority of our interest out before all those horrid things happened.
When we last spoke and we met up in Connemara, actually, and your story was incredible when you were telling me about moving to Ireland and getting set up, and it was like obstacle after obstacle. And then you told me about Delphi, Bahamas, and you set that up right as the biggest financial crash since the 1930s kicked in.
Yeah.
And then I read the article about you in Chapel House. And, oh, that's brilliant. I have to catch up. And then next minute, COVID kicks in.
Yeah, no, we had a spectacular 36 hours here earlier in the year when we lost all our bookings for the season, all at one go. And we'd built up a nice little portfolio of guests for this season, and every single one of them naturally, understandably, pulled out because many of them were coming from America, one or two from South Africa, Luxembourg. There was some strange sort of international connections that we'd inherited through Delphi, people we knew. And of course, you can't travel. And even if they could have traveled, because of our health status here, we have to be pretty damn careful anyway about taking people in. So our lockdown has been quite brutal. But we lost a lot. And you just have to take it on the chin, really. There's nothing else you can do about it. There are people a lot worse off than us who have suffered much more severely. But nonetheless, that was kind of envisaged as an important part of our annual income, and that's gone.
Do you ever kind of just, like I said, going back to the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s, you kind of, at any stage, you turn your hair out looking up at God going, Jesus, what did I do? Like,
Well, I have thought of opening a stock brokerage firm where my clients do the exact opposite of what I recommend, because it seems to me that there is a law of opposites happening. But no, look, yeah, we've been unlucky in some ways, but we've been unbelievably lucky in other ways. So it's very, very hard to complain in the round, really.
what is it? Because you made a success after all difficulties with Delphi Connemara, and the same with Delphi Bahamas, and I'm sure you will do the exact same with Chapel House. What is it you think, like even people that are listening to this, maybe whether it's going through difficulties with their own business or even looking to set up a business, whether it's fly fishing or any other industry, what is it that think allows you to kind of overcome the difficulties and turn it into a success?
Well, success. I mean, I've always said that much of what we've done has been successful in terms of pleasing most of the people who participate, but by any sort of commercial objective yardstick, our financial success has never been particularly significant. But that wasn't, of course, the objective. I mean, our objective throughout, since back in my 30s, was to find an enjoyable way you know, of living, which would also please the people who came to join in. So it was more about people pleasures than financial pleasures, and hopefully we can continue that. You make tremendous friends and build a fantastic network of contacts through the fly fishing world. And fly fishing, almost by definition, the people who do it tend to be agreeable, and that is deeply pleasurable. And when they come back, as hopefully they will, year after year after year, then you get to know people really well, and form bonds that survive all kinds of setbacks and mishaps.
What made you keep going though? Because you never threw the towel in. You never said, "Do you know what? No, I made a mistake here. I need to go down another path."
Well, it would be romantic to think that we never thought of throwing the towel because we certainly did. And there may have been others that might have liked to pull the towel out from underneath us, notably bank managers at various stages. But I don't know, really. I think the Delphi Island thing had just become such a challenge that I was youthful enough and idealistic enough to think that that was worth taking on and trying to overcome. But the reality also was that had we pulled out at a moment in time that was disadvantageous, then obviously we'd have lost our shirts in terms of our investment. The same, to some extent, is true in the Bahamas, that whilst we had no idea that this devastating hurricane was coming or this horrid disease would hit the world, I was always slightly nervous about the undertaking and what could go wrong. And you just focus on trying to do the very best you can at the time and hope that your worst fears are never realized. And in some senses, we've been blessed with good timing on our exits from these various undertakings. And Chapel House is not something that I ever envisage stopping until I physically can't do it anymore. So there's no need to worry, even if the level of guests is not always as robust as we might wish it to be. You know, we still live here. It's a deeply pleasurable part of the country to live. We're very lucky, and I can, still do what I like doing.
And it's a testament, I suppose, Peter, as well, to what you previously achieved, in the sense that what you're saying is most of your guests or your bookings are from people that you got to know through Delphi Connemara and Delphi Bahamas.
Yeah, almost entirely. Yeah. And that's how we would wish it to be, really. Again, it's more about not only them enjoying it, but us enjoying them. And that may be a bit selfish, but I'm old enough to, I think, just about merit that.
If you had known what you were getting yourself in for, whether Delphi Connemara or Delphi Bahamas, do you think you'd still have gone ahead and done it?
Oh, Lord. Delphi Island, without any doubt, because whilst we were naive and idealistic in starting out and deeply ignorant of the realities of what would happen, no, I have no regrets. It was extremely interesting and huge challenge to beat the odds, as it were. And from the very start, we had all these disasters with the row over canoeing and gold mining, and then the sea trout crisis and salmon farming and all that. But I think had it not been for at least some of those crises, our life would have been rather dull and lonely in this little valley in the west of Ireland. And it did at least expose us to a whole world of politics and finance and campaigning and all of that was in many ways stimulating, but also on many occasions very frustrating. Then switching over to the Bahamas, I kind of always thought that it would only be a 10-year thing. In theory, we could have carried it on for another stint if everybody who was involved wanted to. But it just seemed like again, a fun thing to do. But because we were starting from scratch in the middle of nowhere in a country that probably wouldn't mind me describing it as pretty third world, on a little island where the logistics of life were very complicated, I knew that was never going to be easy. And probably there were more times in the Bahamas when I regretted what we'd done than there were in Ireland. But that was purely because I couldn't at the time see a way out of it after the global meltdown of 2008 and the complete collapse of property prices in Florida, which badly affected the Bahamas. I mean, probably at one stage prices were down by about 60%. But that meant that not only my investment, but the investment of all my pals who had joined in on it was hammered if we were to pull out and realize the loss. Now, many of them could probably have afforded to carry the loss, but I'm not sure that I could. So we decided to hang on in anyway, and very fortunately came across a gang of regular guests who were keen to take it on. And were considerably better funded than we ever were, and so they've been able to do a lot of things that we would have only dreamt of doing. So it all worked out very well in the end, but that was purely fortuitous, I think.
If you hadn't had that, actually, the extra financial backers to be able to jump in with the deeper pockets, would you have been able to have kept Delphi Bahamas going as an ongoing concern?
Oh, no, definitely not. I mean, nothing I've ever done has been done entirely with my money. And so there have always been people who have liked our plan and wanted to participate. And I mean, no, crikey, the investment in the Bahamas was massive. I think it was $6 million, and I didn't have that kind of money. So we put together a gang of people, mostly drawn from those we knew through Delphi Ireland, um, who all joined in as small shareholders. And without them, it would not have been conceivable. No, definitely not.
I get the sense, though, Peter, from what you're saying as well, it's been able to stick it out in many ways. That, the downturns, it comes in cycles. What goes down will come up again, and it's been able to see yourself through those tough periods.
I think that's true, but that's probably a function of the fact that fly fishing and good crack are a wonderful combination. That people who are into either or both, it's not ephemeral. It doesn't pass away. It's there all the time. So if you find somewhere or something where you can indulge those desires comfortably and agreeably, then what's not to like, and people will keep coming back, or will back the idea of keeping it going. All fishermen know that you have good weeks and bad weeks, and good years and bad years, and they always have known that. If they don't know that, they wouldn't be consistent fishermen. So we're kind of used to taking the rough with the smooth, I think. Having said that, some of the issues that we bumped up against were pretty unforeseeable. The most devastating one was the hurricane in the Bahamas, but thank God I had done the deal to extricate ourselves, ahead of that hurricane. So that deal would have collapsed had the hurricane come a few months earlier.
Just maybe remind people, actually, which hurricane was this? What year?
It was in September last year, and it was called Dorian, and it was the most powerful hurricane ever in the Atlantic to make landfall. And it completely devastated our island above all others, because we got a direct hit on the little capital town, which is called Marsh Harbour. Was completely and utterly destroyed. Fortunately, the club, Delphi Club, was perhaps about 8 miles outside the inner core of the hurricane. And so the damage to us was relatively minor. But inside that inner core, it was total wipeout. And the whole infrastructure of the island, still hasn't recovered. In fact, somebody I know was there recently, and a taxi driver gave them a tour around Marsh Harbour to look at the damage. And my friend said it was as if the hurricane had only hit last week. So even 8 months, 9 months later, the damage was so severe that the place, is going to struggle to ever get back properly on its feet. So running a fishing lodge where all your supply and logistics depend on that town is pretty nightmarish for the people who've taken it on from us.
And then you've the double whammy, where because the Bahamas obviously depends so much on tourism, and then COVID comes, and the season's wiped out.
Absolutely, and as I say, the Bahamian government introduced a lockdown that was pretty severe, a total blockage on people coming into the country. So sort of shooting themselves in the foot, but perhaps necessarily so, because I see from the statistics that they've only had, I think, 103 cases in the whole Bahamas, and I think 11 deaths. So that's a pretty good outcome, although, of course, they're not out of the woods yet. And we'll see how the easing of the lockdown goes. They're so close to America that you would be fearful of a second wave. We'll see what happens.
And just as an aside as well, I suppose, just in relation to the climate change, that you're seeing more hurricanes, stronger hurricanes, that you would be fearful for the future, wouldn't you? In terms of if you were still out there.
Well, funnily enough, the lodge, the club, was built specifically with hurricanes in mind. We had a brilliant architect who I said, look, don't spare anything on making sure that this is totally hurricane proof. And he said, look, I guarantee you it'll be good for any hurricane up to category 4. And I said, well, great. How many categories are there? And he said, well, actually, there are 5. And I said, so what happens if we get a category 5 hurricane? He said, well, they're extremely rare. And he said, there's probably no building in the world that could be guaranteed to withstand a category 5 hurricane, and, except for a concrete pillbox. So that sort of stuck with me at the time. He was smiling as he said it, and that slightly alarmed me. And so nobody was expecting a direct hit from a category 5 hurricane. And we actually didn't get that direct hit. It was the town that got it. So the building survived. If we did get a direct hit from a category 5 hurricane, heaven only knows what would happen. But typically what does happen is the roof gets ripped off and then everything inside gets destroyed. So you pray and you insure. And we were paying, I think, $60,000 a year just to insure the building and contents against the risk of a hurricane, which we had to do because of our investors' money.
Puts the bleakness of Connemara weather into context, I think.
Well, it certainly does. Although I do remember living through a couple of definite hurricanes in Delphi, Ireland. They would have been easily over the 73-mile-an-hour point at which a hurricane is declared. Remember that terrible St. Stephen's Day storm of, you probably were too young to remember it, but must be about 25 years ago. And several other really bad storms, which would be funneled up the Delphi Valley because of the steep mountains on either side. And there were many, many nights when we thought the roof of our cottage was going to be ripped off.
I suppose the difference between Delphi, Connemara, and then the Bahamas was in Connemara, you'd settle down, you'd put down roots there with the kids and schools and all that. So it was a real kind of bringing kids up nearly in that sense. Whereas Bahamas was the kids had moved on and you were that bit older. Do you feel more rooted or tied to Ireland because of that?
Certainly, I think my children do. I mean, they're Irish. They regard themselves as Irish. And probably us leaving Delphi hit them more hard than anybody else. But we all still go back from time to time, and we have many, many friends over there. Although we recently did sell our cottage over there. And although my sort of Irish credentials are more genetic than my accent might indicate, at the end of the day, they're fully Irish in the sense that they were born and reared over there, and think of themselves as Irish.
And do you think they'll keep up the ties maybe and keep visiting?
Yeah, I mean, I actually thought at one stage that one of them was going to move over there, but in the event, neither of them have, although one's on Anglesey, just a ferry right away. No, I don't. It's hard to predict the future actually for them, but the ties are strong. Whereas I never for a moment felt any sort of personal bond with the Bahamas. It was more about looking after the staff who are fabulous, and the challenge of getting all the logistics sorted out, and of course designing the place and sorting it all out. That's fun.
Tell me this, in the current context in terms of the fly fishing, would you advise if somebody said, right, I'm thinking of getting into fly fishing, lodge, hospitality side of things, would you advise them against it?
I most certainly probably would. I mean, I think without wishing to appear to be overtly plugging my little book, anybody who reads Double Delphi is certainly going to think twice about even attempting what we did. And against a backdrop now where salmon runs are continuing to collapse globally, it seems, and sea trout are largely a thing of the past in the west of Ireland. And even brown trout fishing has its share of problems in terms of global warming and droughts and pollution and all the challenges of the modern world. Building a business based on fishing is a minor form of lunacy, but building it based on migratory fish is a major form of lunacy. And no, I wouldn't recommend it to anybody unless they had very, very deep pockets. And even then, it's probably like burning cash.
Or sadomasochistic tendencies.
Yes, exactly.
Tell me just about, for people that are listening to this, about a bit of background about the River Test and where Chapel House is and that whole area where you are in England.
Yeah, sure. Well, we're in Hampshire, in the south of England, the sort of central south of England, not far from the coast. Nearest big city would be Southampton, but we're actually about equidistant between Salisbury, Winchester, and Andover. And the Test Valley, or the River Test, is arguably the home of dry fly fishing. It's one of many chalk streams in the area, which means that it flows out of the downs or hills, which are largely chalk. And so the rivers run very, very, very clear. And the aquifers underneath the chalk store up vast quantities of water and release them very, very slowly throughout the year. So after a winter like the one we've just had, we're more or less guaranteed good flows of clean water right throughout the current fishing season. So it was back here in the 19th century that Halford and Skews wrote their sort of definitive books on fishing the chalk streams and invented the dry fly. It's extraordinarily beautiful English countryside, very gentle, lots of water meadows, beautiful clear water, fabulous wildlife. It really is quintessentially English perfection in terms of rural attractiveness. But the River Test is, along with the Itchen and the Avon and the Wiley and many other little chalk streams, they're pretty sought after. And they've been traditionally quite expensive to fish because they're not huge rivers. And what it means is that the fishing has been subject to quite a lot of pressure over the past 100 years, increasingly so in recent decades. And so most of the fish that people now catch are actually stocked fish rather than wild fish. And some people find that objectionable. In our case, we're very, very fortunate to have a friend who owns a stretch on the upper Test where there are no stocked fish and where the average wild brown trout is probably about £1.25 pounds. And you fish with a little 3-weight rod. Whereas further downstream, people are generally fishing with 5-weight rods for trout that are averaging 2.5 to 3 pounds, but stocked.
And is it dry fly only?
No, on some beats it is, but that's very purist, and I've never been a complete purist. No, nymphing is allowed on our bits and on most bits because there are simply days when the fish aren't rising. They're not taking fish off the surface. And you can sit there and twiddle your thumbs all day, but if the fish aren't rising and you're fishing dry fly, you're just not going to catch them. So we allow nymphing. Downstream nymphing is is permitted on most beats, and that's probably how 50% of the fish are caught.
And is that mainly sight fishing, Peter?
It's almost entirely sight fishing. I mean, that's the whole pleasure of it, and it's also what it has in common with bone fishing, that because of the clarity of the water, you're fishing for fish that you can see, and if you can't see them, then there's hardly any point in fishing, because that's not the pleasure. You've got these gorgeous shallow rivers which have sort of light gravel coloured bottom, then weed beds of ranunculus streaming down, with the fish lying between or among them, or on the gravel beds where you can see them very clearly. And the job is to tempt them, just as it is with bone fishing. But that depends on what they're doing. Are they surface feeding, or are they, not feeding at all? But a blank day is pretty rare. This mayfly season just ended. It has been actually very poor. We are very lucky to be released from lockdown in order to be able to fish. But, well, that wasn't the main reason for lockdown, but it was the main reason as far as we were concerned to get excited. But in the event, although the weather was spectacular, the fishing was lousy. And nobody's quite sure why, but it might be to do with the huge floods in the winter, which washed everything away.
And what about the fly hatches? Have you seen a change because
no,
of...
Well, this year, yes. I mean, we had a very poor hatch of mayfly this year compared to last year and the year before. And as I say, that was probably a function of the enormous floods that we had in January, which washed out a huge amount of weed and silt, and mayfly larvae come out of the silt. They like mud, basically. So if that all gets swept away, they get swept away. But Mother Nature, I mean, there were plenty of mayfly, but nothing like as many as you would expect in a glorious mayfly week. But rather like salmon, Mother Nature will repopulate them pretty quickly.
It's like taking a step back in terms of the kind of the history of fly fishing, really, to where it all began. It's worth taking a trip over. If they want to find out more information, Peter, how can they get it?
Yeah, okay, no problem. The website is chapelhouse1841.com. At least I think it is. Yes, I'm sure it is. And most of the information is there. I mean, typically what people do is come and fish, or come and stay for 3 nights, fish for just a couple of days, ideally one on an upper wild fish beat and one on our lower stocked beat. And they can stay for longer if they want to, but that is a typical little package. And we might eat in the local gastropubs in the evening. We give them a big picnic basket lunch and hearty breakfast at the beginning of the day. We've got a great guide who knows everything there is to know about the river test. And I don't want this to sound like a sales spiel, but it is a small taste of deep pleasure, I think, is the best way of looking at it. But it would not appeal to those people who would prefer to hike up a rocky mountain and fish some river in Montana, or indeed a mountain in New Zealand. It's far more leisurely than that, and kind of more bucolic, more pastoral, and but no less pleasurable for that.
Peter, thanks a million for joining us, and hopefully we'll, you'll be back to Ireland sometime, and keep in touch with the fly fishing and the people in Ireland here, because you left a great legacy, in fairness. So and people will be for always grateful for that. Like,
well, thanks, Darren.
And also just want to mention Double Delphi. It's an incredible book. Peter wrote it probably about 2-3 years ago, describing your whole story between Delphi Connemara and Delphi Bahamas. Maybe you'll have to bring out a sequel.
Well, I might have to, because we've run out of copies of the first edition. I think we've only got about 10 copies left. So.
It's a brilliant read as well, so I'd recommend it. Peter, continued success, and hopefully when all the lockdown eases and the world is back to some sort of normality, you'll be back up on your feet and running with the Chapel House once again.
Thanks, Darren.
My thanks to Peter Mantle for joining me on this week's show, and if you do fancy some chalk stream fly fishing in England, do check out chapelhouse1841.com for more information. Don't forget to rate, review and subscribe to the Ireland on the Fly podcast on Apple, Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts from. You can also keep up to date on IrelandOnTheFly.com as well as on Instagram, and I'll be back next week with another episode about the people and places of fly fishing in Ireland.